one of the heroes of my new book, The Poets and the Fathers, Theology and Poetry, from Gregory Nazianzus to Scott Cairns, is that first mentioned poet, Gregory Nazianzus. He's known often as Saint Gregory Nazianzus, or even Saint Gregory the Theologian in Christian tradition. And he was a poet, orator, and theologian of the early church. Now, Gregory was born around 330, and 330 was sort of towards the end of the reign of the very famous Emperor Constantine. Constantine, most famously, had legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. Sometimes you get this sort of historical confusion where people say, well, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's not true. He merely legalized it and also kind of gave a blanket religious freedom edict in 313 called the Edict of Milan, where he basically said, you're free to worship any god you choose, and the Christians in particular, they need to not be persecuted like they were. A lot of their property had been taken away, and Constantine kind of made the Roman government give back their property. So Gregory was born into this newly religiously free and very pluralistic Roman society. Gregory was born and raised in Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey. This was a world of wealthy estates, of lots of land, of well-to-do people. Now, off to the west, over the Hellespont, was the city of Constantinople. And Gregory lived his life kind of out of the spotlight of Constantinople, but always knowing it was there. He got the best education that you could get in that day and age. He had the best tutors in Cappadocia, and he ended up around the later high school, early college years, as we think of it, going to the academy at Athens. Now, the academy was started by Plato. Now, Plato had been dead for more than 600 years, but Gregory attended the academy and basically rubbed shoulders with the most famous young intellectuals of his day in that part of the world. The two most important were Basil the Great, who became known in his own right as an orator, a theologian, and a good friend/frenemy of Gregory. He also ran into someone who would end up being a frenemy. This person was the Emperor Julian. He was not yet emperor. He was sort of a princeling at that point. But he would go on to be an emperor, and instead of remembering fondly his time with the Christians at the Academy at Athens, he would end up being rather hostile to Christians. In particular, he didn't want Christians having an intellectual influence in the schools of the Roman Empire. So Gregory grew up in this climate where Christianity was legal, but depending on who was emperor, you might not be very favored. And also, which Christianity, whose version of theology, was a big question. When Gregory graduated from the academy at Athens, went home to Cappadocia, he wanted to start a career where he basically lived in solitude, maybe with a couple other sort of scholar clergy who, served at church, but also mostly who dedicated themselves to prayer and study. He himself didn't want to be a clergyman, but he liked being around that kind of high intellectual culture that blended a sort of greatness in pagan oratory, philosophy, and poetry, with also a desire to be a Christian, to serve the church, to think about theological things intellectually. Now, Basil said, I want that too. And so they ended up going back to Cappadocia together. They didn't live very far from each other. But Basil was very, very adamant that the way to live this life best, the way to serve both the church and the culture best, was to become a priest, to become a bishop, to wield ecclesiastical power. Gregory didn't want that. And Basil kind of convinced him to become a priest. And Gregory resented this a little bit. And eventually, Basil and Gregory's father, who was a bishop, they decided we need to make young Gregory a bishop. And so they kind of surprise ordained him a bishop, and Gregory really resented this. He just wanted to sit alone, writing orations, meditating on the questions of the nature of being and the nature of beauty as they related to God and theology and culture. Gregory would sometimes run away. When he was first ordained a priest, he ran away and hid in a neighboring town. And we, in fact, have his sermon the Sunday that he came back from hiding, apologizing to his congregation. I've been gone a few weeks. I know I'm your new pastor. Forgive me. I really didn't want to be a priest. So this is something that Gregory struggles with. He's a very hesitant leader. The sort of most important thing that happens in Gregory's life in the later part of the century, this is around 379, 380 AD, is tragedy and then opportunity. Basil dies in the late 370s, and this is a hard blow to Gregory. Basil and Gregory, after Gregory had been ordained a bishop, they didn't really talk to each other. Gregory kind of felt betrayed by Basil. And yet Basil dies, and soon afterward, the church at large, the group of bishops who are overseeing the church in that part of the world, say, hey, Constantinople is really facing some cultural crisis, especially when it comes to Christianity and Christian doctrine. And so they call on Gregory, they say, hey, we know you're trained in oratory, you're trained in the intellectual culture, both of the pagans and the Christians. Could you go to Constantinople and set the right perspective for people who are wondering, who's God? What does the Bible teach? What does this have to do with pagan culture and philosophy? And Gregory, begrudgingly, but ultimately willingly, goes up and serves as the priest at a congregation called Anastasia. And this was a small congregation, but the fact that Gregory ended up there as priest, preaching every Sunday, it drew crowds, not just of Christians, not just of kind of religious people who were maybe a little Christian but weren't sure, even people who still worship the pagan gods. They would come to hear this great orator. And what Gregory did was he preached a series of sermons, which we now call the 5 theological orations. He preached them about the nature of the Trinity. And he drew on the Council of Nicaea, which had taken place about 5 years before he was born. And the Council of Nicaea had preached that Christ was God. Christ is not just a creature. Christ wasn't just a good teacher. He wasn't even like a demigod, like Dionysus or Heracles. He was really God incarnate. Also, there was a Holy Spirit who was the third member of the Trinity, as was talked about by St. Paul and the Gospel writers. And so Gregory very boldly preached this Nicene doctrine of the Trinity. And it caused such an influence that a church council was called to really settle this once and for all. And Gregory was asked by the emperor himself to be kind of the overseer of this whole council. There were a lot of political factions, both in the church and in the court, that didn't like Gregory, that saw him as a threat. Both he's really smart and powerful, and his words are very convincing to people, and we can't let him gain power. Sometimes this was just jealousy. There was a strong Eunomian faction in Constantinople that didn't believe Jesus was God, that didn't believe the Spirit was God, and they thought that Gregory was going to get the upper hand. And so there were lots of machinations, and Gregory saw this taking place. He had to walk around with armed guards at times because people were worried about him being assassinated. And finally, Gregory gives this famous sermon at the council. This ended up being called the First Council of Constantinople. And he says, look, I've preached the truth as far as I can see it. I've given a good example. I'm getting out of here. I'm causing too much controversy. I'm causing too much stress. I'm officially retiring from the game of being a professional celebrity intellectually and theologically in Constantinople. And he goes home. Now, if you've been listening up to this point, you would say, what does this have to do with poetry? Well, what Gregory did for the last 10 years of his life, from around 380, 381 until his death around 390, is he wrote poetry. Now, Gregory's poetry is often divided into what we think of as biographical poems and then theological poems. The theological poems, often called the Poemata Arcana, are these beautiful poems mostly written in dactylic hexameter, the meter of Virgil and Homer. And they talk about the doctrine of the Trinity as this great kind of intellectual adventure. The mind sets forth to begin to glimpse the Godhead. And these are thrilling poems. They're very doctrinally dense, very lush and beautiful in their metaphors and imagery. And people have often looked at these as the most important poems of Gregory's. But in my book, one of the poems I focus on that gets a lot of attention as well, not as much theological attention, is a poem where he talks about why he writes. And he gives these 4 reasons for writing. Now, we don't have time to go into the 4 reasons now, but these 4 reasons really articulate what I argue in my book is one of the first and most important coherent Christian accounts of why we write poetry, how it fits into human culture and human flourishing. The other thing that he's famous for writing is a series of epigrams. He wrote hundreds of them. These are short poems that meditate usually on someone he loves who has died. One of the other most important autobiographical poems of Gregory is called On My Own Life. It's a very long poem, hundreds of lines long, and it basically tells his life story. And, people have made a lot of Augustine's Confessions as being the first really introspective, almost very modern feeling exploration of one's life and sort of questioning about who am I, what's my purpose in this world. But Gregory's On My Own Life actually predates Augustine's Confessions by a decade or two and has a lot of that same introspection that Augustine has, but it's all in iambic verse. It almost feels like a sort of Aeneid, where the journey is not to Rome, but the journey is from youthful naivety and desire for fame all the way to a elderly adulthood that has seen through fame, that has seen through the passing things of this world, and hopes only for eternity. Together with the Poemata Arcana, the poem that has the 4 reasons for writing, and this long autobiographical introspection, Gregory emerges as one of the most important voices, not just in poetry, but in Greek literary consciousness from the late antique period. He is a titan of thought, of felicitous expression in verse and in prose, and he's really worth our time hanging out with.